Good evening, good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jess Scully. I'm the Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Sydney. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And for me, I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. So I want to extend my respect to elders past and present of the Eora Nation and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded over this place. It's such a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I'm giddy. Because this is a very special event here. It's a special global conversation for the Committee for Sydney. Now, the committee is a member-funded independent think tank and a champion for the whole of Sydney. They've got the aim of enhancing the economic, social, cultural and environmental conditions that make Sydney a truly unique, special, exceptional global city with so much potential. And this series, The Global Conversations, started at the beginning of the pandemic, motivated by the idea of providing a generosity of ideas, by the desire to share information and create windows for discussion in a time that's uncertain, that's made us all question assumptions, and sometimes that's a really good thing. And in 2021, this series continues with global thought leaders sharing big, bold, exciting, inspiring, and in the case of tonight, absolutely transformative thinking. I'm delighted to introduce Mariana Mazzucato here and to welcome her to Sydney virtually.
Wonderful to be here
this morning. This evening.
The sun is shining in London.
Oh, delightful. Well, it's just gotten dark here in Sydney. And look, I want to tell people a little bit about who you are, although I'm assuming that everyone on this call knows who you are. But Mariana Mazzucato is a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College London. She's the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's won a whole swag of prizes, including the 2020 John Van Neumann Award, the 2019 All European Academy's Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values, the 2018 Leon Teff Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. The list goes on. I mean, you've probably read one of her books, The Entrepreneurial State, The Value of Everything, and now, of course, Mission Economy, which is a guide to helping us all. There it is. There's a guide to helping us save capitalism, basically, change capitalism, but also to reimagine our role, because a lot of people on this call are policymakers. They're people like me who believe in the role of government to transform lives and to shepherd and steward and direct our commonwealth. And, you know, Mariana's advised so many nations and global organisations. And she's really one of those handful of economists who are changing the way we think about the role of government and what we can do together and challenging us all to aim big. So we're in great hands tonight. Mariana, we've talked a little bit about who's on this call, but there's policymakers, leaders from state and local government, business, universities, not-for-profit, cultural institutions, scientists, economists, architects. We want to hear from all of you excellent people on this call, so please share your questions in the chat. We will come to them in about 30 minutes or so. Mariana, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jess. And can I just say it's such an honor also because we have some common friends and they said, finally, you and Jess together. So I see this more as a party. I mean, for your time zone, it's more of a party. For me, it's a big wake-up call.
I will get some wine out any minute. Thank you. I'm so delighted to be having this chat with you. You know, I think you've asked us to reimagine our roles, and in all of your work you've asked us to question how value is created in the economy, which is like it's just a foundational question, and as I said before, you know, this is a moment to question those foundational assumptions and how, of course, benefit is derived and shared from that value and how it's recouped from a public investment as well. So let's dive first into the moon mission and take us on this mission in Mission Economy. What are some of those key attributes from the Apollo mission that you've drawn out and you want to bring to our attention?
I was just coughing, so I put it on mute, but now I'm not on mute. So, I mean, first, again, thank you so much. And just something quickly on value, because I'm not sure if we'll come back to it. For me, it all has to begin there, because then, you know, otherwise the problem is you just get a lot of kind of public money doing things, but often actually just filling the gap where something exists, including in cities, you know, filling public space is filling the gap perhaps where there's no private space, right? So in economics, this is called fixing a market failure. The market screws up, as we know. The whole financial crisis was a big mess up, or it also doesn't, invest enough in certain things, and the government, through different types of tools, might come in and fill that gap. And this is very much not what I'm talking about. I actually founded the whole institute that you mentioned on public purpose to really rethink the state as doing not fixing markets, but co-creating and co-shaping. And I'm sure we'll come back to that, because then the question is with who? It's not just with business, with all sorts of other actors. But that framing about, co-creating and co-shaping markets means we also have to begin with, well, what do you even mean by the market, right? So the market's actually an outcome. The market's not out there as something that every now and then crumbles apart and you got to fix it. The market is an outcome of how we govern all the different actors that co-create value. So that means how we govern different types of public institutions, whether they're the BBC or a Department of Health. Private institutions, which we know have different governance structures, they can just be maximizing, shareholder value, or have a broader concept of, say, stakeholder value. Trade unions, without which we wouldn't have weekends, great social innovation, 8-hour workday, but especially how they interrelate one with another. So the reason I wrote the book on mission economy is actually, I started writing it when it was 50 years ago. Now it's 51 years ago. 51 years ago when, humans did something incredibly hard, because it's much harder than delivering personal protection equipment to frontline workers, which we didn't do very well globally. Got a man to the moon and back in one generation, as, Kennedy set out. And that was hard. They had no clue how to do it when Kennedy, had that famous speech in Rice Stadium. So the willingness to experiment, to innovate, to declare that there's a big goal, to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. Imagine if we had that kind of talk today with climate change, or, the digital divide, which we know, I'm sure, Australia, every country has a digital divide, but we've realized just how bad it is with lockdown, with so many kids not getting their kind of human right to education when they're just kind of locked up in their homes, very different access to digital technology. So imagine if we had really concrete goals and threw at it the real kind of weight of inspiration, leadership, but especially collaboration. So it wasn't just aeronautics. There was huge amounts of investment in nutrition, materials, electronics, the whole software industry as we know it today. What we today mean by software in some ways was a spillover of that mission. Lots of collaboration with companies. It was NASA and General Electric, Honeywell, Motorola. So this wasn't, all about the state. And, that's usually the pushback I get. She's just glorifying the state. No, lots of public-private partnerships. But what was so cool is they thought about the partnership. NASA even had a clause in the contracts that said no excess profits. In other words, this ain't going to be a gambling casino, guys. We're going to do something really cool together. But it's not just about, sending us any kind of bill for your costs. In fact, they changed the procurement contract from being just cost plus, which could be easily gamed and inflated, to fixed price procurement contracts, so a fixed fee, with constant incentives for quality improvement and innovation. So lots of the innovation that came out of that, from foil blankets, baby formula, camera phones, all the spillovers that happened along the way, were really kind of catalyzed and nurtured in. There was real collective intelligence, but it didn't happen just because, let's go partner. It was designed into the process. And I think there's so much to learn, especially from that. And I could say more, but I need to let you get a word in.
Well, look, there are 10 things I want to pick up on there, so I'm already off course. But we will come back, and I want to talk to you about spillovers, because it's about not putting the cart before the horse, right? Exactly. It's about going back to having a mission, actually a government with intention. That is saying, this is what we're here, this is the problem we're here to solve, but we're going to be flexible and collaborative in getting to the solution. But there's a distinction that you've made that I find really clarifying, and I would like you to tease it out for us, because it's not just about investing in innovation, right? There's a difference between projects, sectors, and missions. And can you explain that distinction and why we've got to center the mission to get that big impact?
Sure. So, just in case it wasn't clear to others, because you said it really perfectly, it's not about the technology, right? So, in my book, The Entrepreneurial State, I say everything that makes our iPhones or smartphones smart, from the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, they all basically came from public investment or some form of public procurement, so it was like government money that made it happen, but not because they said, oh, we need the internet, like today everyone talks about, quantum computing, AI, driverless cars. No, they had a problem. And what was the problem at the time? It was getting the satellites to communicate, right? So you can see that these are often, unfortunately, military kind of Cold War problems. The problems we have today have to be, because we've signed up to them, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. They can all break down into lots of different missions. But currently what the UN has done, which is very helpful, is they've broken them down into 169 targets, which are kind of at a different level of missions. And we'll get to that in a second. But that's where we have to start, right? These are societal goals. They're harder than getting to the moon, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from those really interesting issues around risk-taking, experimentation, dynamic, symbiotic public-private partnerships, not parasitic ones, which unfortunately we sometimes have in areas like health. And so I have a poster for you. You guys said no PowerPoint, so I'm going to cheat. No, because I do this stuff a lot. Woo-hoo. So let's start with, sorry. So SDG 13. So this is mission-oriented innovation. It comes from a report I wrote for the European Commission, where we tried to help them rethink basically the innovation policy of the Commission, away from just a random list of, sectors, technologies, types of firms like SMEs. Said, think of the big problems. The obvious one, of course, is climate change. So this is a challenge level, right? This is SDG 13 or SDG 14, cleaning up our oceans, life below water. What does it mean to transform something like climate change into a mission? And by the way, who does that? You guys, right? It's not some random economist that shows up on a Zoom call that will tell Sydney what your mission is. Obviously, that's going to have to be an outcome of all sorts of, different stakeholder engagement. And again, we can come back to that later. But what a mission is it's specific, it's concrete. You can actually say yes or no, did you achieve it? So with the moon mission, had they just stopped with space race, beat the Russians, Sputnik, that was the challenge. The mission was get to the moon and back in one generation. You can actually answer, did you do it? Did you not? Forget the conspiracy theory that says they never did it. They did do it, right? So then you transform it, something like this: 100 carbon neutral cities by 2030, reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions on balance of 100 European cities by 2030. This was one we worked with the Commission. And the main point here is, as we said, that the moon mission wasn't just, aeronautics. Something like this is not just going to be about renewable energy, right? Or even just, redoing buildings. It has to be an outcome of all sorts of collaborations between food, mobility, behavioral, changes in people, the environment, real estate, construction materials, the social sector, schools, right? We can talk about this later if you want, but there's, something that Dan Hill, who I know you know well, he's the head of innovation in Vinnova, the Swedish innovation agency. They're working with schools on school meals. What does it mean to bring that carbon neutral agenda to something as specific as a school canteen? So healthy, tasty, sustainable school meals. And then the hard bit is the projects. In other words, this is where you need to redesign what government currently does. I mentioned procurement before, which is a big, large, percentage of government budgets. Procurement, grants, loans, the design of an industrial strategy to really crowd in, galvanize, catalyze as many bottom-up projects and experimentation. A lot of these will go wrong, right? So that willingness to fail is part of the process. And it doesn't mean you just say, oh yeah, let's fail. How cool will that be? It means let's try this. It's going to be hard. Things might go wrong, but we're going to learn from that failure. And learning by doing doesn't just happen because you say it. You need to invest in your own capacity to learn, invest in your culture to take risks, to welcome uncertainty. We have someone here who we see. Hello. So welcome uncertainty, risk-taking and so on, have a portfolio approach, but also, this is something that I've written about a lot, invest in-house as opposed to outsourcing in the government brain to learn by doing. That kind of trial and error is something that we don't allow today civil servants. As soon as they make a mistake, bang, front page of the Daily Mail, right? So, that's really important for that project level. But the difference between a challenge and a mission is the mission you can actually say yes or no. And missions should be designed to bring in as many different sectors as possible. So a cancer mission, if it's just about, health and the pharmaceutical industry, say drugs, that's not what I mean by mission. It would have to bring in lots of different sectors, for example, that would look at preventative, areas in terms of changing lifestyles.
Yeah, and look, there's so much there, and I love that we don't actually even have to go and set the goals. The goals are there. We've signed up to the SDGs. It's a question of selecting which ones we might focus on, perhaps, or at a city level, working out which aspects we're going to focus on first and elevate first, whether it's mobility or, you know, it could be, or it's that broader goal, and then how do you enable the mobility, for example, to achieve it, or building reform and all of those sorts of things.
I have a mobility one. This is one we did with the UK government, because they had before had this just list of sectors. They were focusing on aeronautics, automobiles, life sciences, financial services, and the creative sector. And we said, no, you know, what does that mean? Random list. So they ended up choosing, with the work that we did with them, 4 challenges, one of which was future of mobility. And we turned that into a mission, which for the UK was by 2040, put the UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and emission-free zero accident systems. And just the fact it said universally accessible travel meant that some of these bottom-up projects had to be from areas of disabilities.
See, that's the thing. It's actually having the gumption, I guess, to actually pick a target and be specific. And while we've been talking about very big picture missions, you know, the moon mission initially, but then the SDGs now, you also have been talking about place-based missions that are much more local, and they're a way of sort of bringing this into a more concrete and perhaps relatable context for people to really get involved in. Can you tell us about some of those place-based missions that you're working on?
Sure. Perhaps the most inspiring currently is with Camden Council, which is a council within London. It's a very large council run by Georgia Gould. She's a Labour Party leader. And she and I co-chair the Camden Renewal Commission. And what we decided early on with the, you know, applying the missions approach to Camden was to then nest it, just like I was talking about school meals with the case in Sweden. We actually also have a school meal one, but in places that also would be natural for people to come together, to negotiate, to debate, you know, what they even want, you know, and which often will be actually contested. So we need, you know, safe places to disagree about it too. And so, for example, the mission on carbon neutrality in Camden is also focusing on several housing estates, so social housing, where we're trying to bring also, you know, housing residents, also through citizen assemblies, different forms like citizen assemblies, together to talk about how they want to be living, you know, what does sustainable living mean, as opposed to like a top-down diktat, your life will be better if you have carbon neutral buildings, right? So that one is quite exciting. And, you know, it's not easy to do this stuff. So it's important to sandbox it, I think, you know, in particular places. So Camden currently has chosen 4 housing estates. You know, there's many more. And then you learn how to do that. You learn how to do the engagement in a way that people also start to trust. And then you can scale it up in the same way that if you want to transform procurement from being kind of very linear and again, top down and not driving innovation, it's best to kind of test it out in a particular area and then apply it perhaps across the board in government. So that's an exciting one. Another one is there's lots of knife crime in London, you know, very much actually as an outcome. I don't want to make it sound too simplistic, but a massive austerity that we suffered after the financial crisis, where, you know, the banks caused the crisis and then somehow we blamed people and said, oh, we're now going to cut all your social services to reduce the debt. And so there was big cuts in mental health programs, after school clubs, public libraries. I mean, it's just quite mad, the things that were decided to cut in order to, you know, put back the budget together, which of course didn't work, because if you're cutting the social fabric, you end up creating problems elsewhere that of course cost government money. So knife crime has really escalated in recent years, and we are trying to tackle that, first of all, from a public health angle, not a crime angle, you know, a lot of the social economic determinants of crime, but also focusing on, again, places like youth centers, right? Youth centers themselves that were cut. We can't just say, oh, give them more money. What does it actually mean to turn youth centers into the best that the 21st century can offer, right? The tentacles of, you know, Camden has something called the Knowledge Quarter, literally the best knowledge creating machines you can think of, from the British Library, the Wellcome Trust, CRIC, which is a big a research center, UCL, you know, you can go on, and it's literally face to face with some of the poorest boroughs like Somerstown. So what does it mean to kind of almost change the face of these buildings? So instead of their bum facing the estates, it's their door, wide open, embracing door, and have a real horizontal, not condescending, relationship with the kind of community organizations, whether it's the housing estates and the organizations within them, but also specifically the youth centers. So instead of at best being, oh, here's an app to teach coding to kids, to really have a proper relationship with youth centers, where a lot of the, even say community resources, we've been thinking about something really interesting, which isn't even public yet, but well, maybe I shouldn't talk about it. I'm always terrible when maybe I shouldn't. Anyway, some common good data resources that are currently restricted, even though they're public, what would it look like to house them inside youth centers or community centers, so people can go in and do podcasts with, say, a BBC archive, for example?
I mean, there's a whole other conversation that we actually need to have about the data commons and about, those resources and how they can be enabled and connected back to place, and not to mention the archives and assets of the state and of universities but the idea of actually connecting those and embedding those in places that are experiencing disadvantage is actually transformative. I haven't encountered that before. I love that idea.
And it's a global problem. I'm an advisor for President Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa. And, it's very similar, actually, the problems of inequality, literally like the best that the 21st century offers on one street and literally the worst level of deprivation on another. We have that in both, developed countries and developing countries. And so instead of getting stuck about, oh, that's a rich, country's kind of problem, what does it mean to really tackle these issues at the street level? Because that's where we're seeing it. And inequality is actually increasing globally at the postcode level, right? So the big debate for economists used to be about north-south convergence or divergence. And actually there's been, and I don't want to, again, make this too simplistic, but convergence, kind of, if you just look at big kind of global north, global south, but at the postcode level, at that kind of granular, decentralized level, you see increasing inequality. And that's, true basically globally.
I mean, that's 100% true here as well. I mean, we have such a divide. We have two Sydneys. We have a difference in life expectancy between the east and the west of the city that is staggering, and I've immediately thought of places here in my neighborhood where you have, these sandstone universities on one side of the road and housing estates on the other, and very few connections actually between them, or diminishing connections actually, because there have been programs before, but how do we go beyond and do something deeper? But you've led me to think about the conversation that you've been having and raising about the fact that it's not just about growth. It's not just about jobs and growth, as we'd say in an Australian context, but that growth has a direction and it has a quality, and jobs, there are good jobs and jobs worth having, and then jobs that actually diminish and diminish people's experiences and increase inequality. Can you tell us more about how a mission economy focuses government investment on reducing inequality and actually having a positive, or prioritizing, I should say, public value in government spending, and not just value for money, but in fact, value for society, public value?
Sure. Maybe I'll break that up then into two different issues. One is, this point that growth has not just a rate, but a direction. Missions are about confronting that directionality in an explicit way. Directions happen even when you don't want them to. Deregulation causes a particular direction of the financial sector. So you always have a direction. The question is, can we have a debate, an explicit debate about that direction and what it actually means for the tools that we have on the ground? But also, this is, I guess, the key point for your question, which is a really good one. How do we govern that process in the public interest? So just take the healthcare sector. There's no lack of public money going into health innovation. In the US, which houses a lot of the top pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, the government spends over $40 billion a year on health innovation, and yet doesn't then govern that process to make sure that people who funded it access those drugs, right? So the intellectual property rights get completely abused. Those are patents. They're too wide, used for strategic reasons, too strong, hard to license, too upstream. So the actual tools for research get privatized. The prices of the drugs don't reflect that collective value contribution. So already there, you see huge governance failures that mean that something that could be great, government spending, investing money in, disease areas, then doesn't actually meet people's needs because it's been allowed to just kind of, let's just hope for the best, as opposed to really governing patents and, price systems, et cetera, to reflect public value. But you also see that, of course, with digital platforms. Again, the internet was funded by the public sector. Now we have this huge problem, right, with privacy, with all the issues around big tech. But instead of saying, oh, break up big tech as though that's going to solve the problem, we need really concrete new also, institutions, perhaps. So the city mayor in Barcelona, I'm saying it the Italian way, Ada Colau, she's been fantastic on this front, a very proactive strategy of bringing hackers, a team of computer hackers, into the city government to be civil servants, to create a much more direct link with data as it's created. Every time we click on an app, we create data. That data creation process comes into kind of a city platform that then directly, with no intermediation of the private sector, improves public transport systems, social housing systems, right? So data for the kind of public good, sometimes that needs also new institutions, but also we need to govern that process, right? To make sure that we're not just picking up the mess later. This idea that, again, you're just fixing market failures by definition sets you up to be too little, too late, having big problems that then it's almost too late to solve. So proactive, pre-distribution, not redistribution, a role for government to make sure that all these areas that government, of course, is critical to funding also gets governed, so that people benefit. In terms of jobs, I think one really important thing is just really kind of looking at something super concrete now with COVID-19 is, all this money that is flooding the system, and that's good. We're not doing austerity now in a moment of COVID-19. That would be foolish. But the money that's going into the system, the so-called recovery funds, right? 2 trillion in the US, 1 trillion in the European Commission, Next Generation EU, sure, Australia, many different countries have stimulus packages now. By the way, not all, let's remember, not all. So it is important to do that. However, in order to do that so it actually meets people's needs, we need conditions attached. So, conditionality to make sure that companies that are receiving, help right now do also not just completely fire their workforce once the furlough schemes are over. That's an obvious condition. Or making sure that the profits that are being generated from government support, even in normal times, through guarantees, subsidies, and loans, get reinvested back into the economy instead of extracted out through dividend payments, share buybacks, and so on. Why not? Or making sure that airlines and automobiles, like in France, this actually happened. President Macron said, we're not here to just bail out the automobile industry, we're here to help transform it. So Renault, the car manufacturer, and Air France had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions in order to access the French Recovery Fund. That should be the normal way in which public and private work together. And the word conditionality sounds negative. It sounds like you're kind of, saying, we're not going to help you unless. It should actually be part of a win-win strategy, a real Build Back Better strategy. And, why not? Why not have conditions that are really about people's lives, jobs, working conditions, supply chains going green, but also protecting jobs, and really designing also a just transition, into, for example, a Green Deal, so that I know that you had big issues of this in your last election in Australia, right? That a lot of working people felt that the discussion about climate change and the Green Deal wasn't necessarily going to benefit them, and there perhaps was also a lack of communication, but maybe strategy, I don't know enough about it, about really thinking, how are we going to make sure that people and workers in particular industries that will be transformed are not only protected, but invested in order to be, have the capabilities and the opportunities in a greener economy. That doesn't just happen. You need to embed it also within the contracts, the public-private contracts, but also the trade unions need to be part of that process ex ante, as opposed to just defending workers ex post when it's too late.
I think there's so much in there that is about the deal, and everyone's very excited, or a lot of people who are imagining transformative change from government are excited about the idea of the Green New Deal. But I've heard you focus more on the deal part of the Green New Deal, and it's about rethinking how governments make those deals and set conditions and set limitations, as well as expect more or demand more from the private sector, or even from the community sector, in delivering in return for government investment. And procurement, you mentioned procurement earlier, and I think procurement is at the moment quite a strong limiting factor. You know, when I first got involved in local government, you know, I'm from a creative industries background, and so I've been involved in government now for 5 years, and I have to say the two things that energize me the most and I'm most focused on are land use planning and procurement, because I kind of feel like they are the two secret keys that determine, or the tools that really determine which projects get funded and which projects can be sustained and are enabled, but also who has access to the public goods that enable participation in society and the economy, and which uses are priced in or priced out of the market. You know, those two things for me are fundamental. But for this conversation, let's talk about procurement for a moment. And my experience is that procurement, the structures around procurement for probity reasons are extremely limited and limiting, and they're quite prescriptive rather than being outcomes focused. And you know, how can we embed purpose in contracting from government, and how do we leave room for more experimentation and co-creation when there is, you know, are there any case studies, or is there any guidance you can give us on how we change the way we approach procurement?
So it's a great question, and in some ways you've answered it. You've just laid out the design, which is exactly that. You need to focus on the outcome, but be very open on the how. You know, again, coming back to the moon landing, what was so interesting, and I have, usually when I do the kind of proper PowerPoint, I have these, 20 things that wouldn't have happened without the Apollo program. They were all kind of random and serendipitous and happened along the way. You know, even Viagra, it wasn't meant to do what it does. It was meant to be for the heart. And then something else popped up. You're supposed to laugh. But good, laugh on command. So, but that's very normal with innovation. Often the search for one thing leads to the discovery of something else. So if you're too prescriptive, that doesn't work. But I think where procurement, and especially green procurement, is so interesting is it could be applied to everything, to how you procure, again, school meals, hospital beds can be done in certain ways or others, infrastructure, so-called infrastructure, physical infrastructure. We don't just need more cement and bricks and, in motorways. We need to have a green procurement strategy in order to have, a future mobility strategy that really is about sustainable living. But that requires having really key criteria and characteristics and outcomes that we want from, say, within a future mobility strategy, but the how does have to be left open, because that means that your procurement budget becomes your innovation budget. In the UK, where I have quite a bit of experience, our innovation budget is about 10 billion pounds, what is earmarked specifically as an innovation budget, but just the procurement budget of the Ministry of Transport, Department of Transport, is 4 times that, just of one department. So imagine across the board, public education, public health, public transport, and all the different departments in charge of them having a green procurement and innovative, outlook on that strategy. That becomes, you've just massively increased your innovation budget.
Well, you're moving the whole market because of how you're spending, right?
Yeah. And you're creating the market. You're creating it. Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of confusion around the idea of how governments should interact, or public players should interact in markets. There's this sort of timidity that we shouldn't distort markets, or we shouldn't intervene in ways that are that have this sort of intention or purpose. And how do we kind of shake that mindset that has really taken control?
God, yeah. I mean, again, first, we should always make sure we don't confuse the word market with the word business, right?
Yes.
Coming back to my first point, and it is an important first point, and I don't mean to be pedantic about it, with my charts, professor, but it is, the definition of the market is not the same thing as business. Business investment and innovation is critical. Government investment, both direct and indirect, is critical. And lots of other actors are important in terms of creating value. But the kind of market outcomes we get are determined by the kinds of things that we've just talked about. If you have a completely conditionless bailout program, that gets you a certain kind of economy. So really, this is about helping to direct an economy to fulfill broad, now I'll use the word challenges, inclusive and sustainable growth. And that needs to, and I'm going to say something unfashionable here, not level the playing field through government policy, but tilt the playing field. The problem is that in the past, the word tilting the playing field worried people, still does. So you often hear about, oh, we're not tilting the playing field, we're leveling it. Well, you're not going to level the playing field towards the sustainable development goals. You're not going to get a green transition by just leveling, whatever that means. You need to tilt it, but not tilting it in terms of like picking one sector, one firm, one technology, you know, putting all your eggs in one basket kind of thing, but actually choosing a direction. And by the way, that's not going to be done through, you know, some sort of workshop. That's how people win elections. You know, in democratically elected governments, you should win the election based on your view, your vision of the kind of growth you believe is important. Once, you know, you have publicly elected leaders, that directionality needs to then fall on the specifics, right? So then what does it mean to have a portfolio approach? Again, not just all offshore wind, for example, if you have a renewable energy strategy, but a portfolio approach where you will invest in different types of areas, and especially areas where you don't have private investment, but not in a filling the gap kind of way, but really reimagining, right, what it even means to have a whole new, say, let me take Denmark as an example. Denmark is the #1 provider today of high-tech green digital services to China. That came about through, you know, having a whole startup scene that wasn't being helped because they were just cute little startups, but because cities like Copenhagen had really ambitious green strategies, and the startup scene there was able to kind of fuel new innovative solutions towards that strategy. They ended up having a real hub of new startups providing green digital services, which then a country like China, which is spending over $2 trillion worth to green their entire economy because of their urgent pollution problem, you know, buys in those services, right? So all the different types of, you know, government pulls and pushes that can help create a strategy like that, which then crowds in all sorts of innovative small, medium, and large companies. That doesn't happen by leveling. And tilting also happens through taxation, of course. There's often a misunderstanding about tax. You don't actually need tax revenue to do stuff as a government. You know, when we go to war, have you ever heard of a government saying, oh, sorry, we can't fight World War II, there's no tax revenue, or we can't go to Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran? No, they create the money for that. Now, we don't want to go down that long conversation about where money comes from, but just look at what happens when you have, you know, $2 trillion coming out of the woodwork in the US when just months before they said there was no money. However, once that money is created, the question is, how does it actually land on particular areas? So it doesn't just happen as we had with the financial crisis, where we just flooded the system with liquidity and it ended up back inside the financial sector, right? So how do you also create a system, not just through the investment side, but also the taxation side, that steers the economy in a particular way? So having a really low capital gains tax doesn't get you the kind of long-termism you need in the financial sector to steer, you know, finance towards, say, the real economy instead of just trading existing assets. Having a taxation system that continues to, as in many countries, tax material less than it taxes labor doesn't get you a green transition. The lack of a financial transaction tax doesn't get us, again, long-termism. So you can use tax, including, you know, well-devised R&D tax credits. I'm not a huge fan of them, but when they're well-structured, they can be quite useful. So kind of using, you know, tax incentives to steer the right kind of behavior. We're working actually in Spain with the Biscay region. By we, I mean my Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, to help them make a much more granular taxation system, which helps companies find it favorable, be rewarded to make the kind of investments that help us achieve the SDGs. So an SDG specific kind of tax incentive.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, we need to have a whole other conversation about tax, because I think that it's a huge challenge in Australia, and it is something that the Committee for Sydney has actually been really proactive in doing some advocacy on that front as well. But there are two more questions I want to ask you, and then we're going to go to the audience questions because there are a lot of them. But let's talk about capacity, you know, as briefly as we can, because doing all of this, redesigning contracts, negotiating good deals, aiming for big picture innovation and transformation, and also tilting the playing field, steering the economy in a meaningful way, it requires the public sector to have the capacity to do that work. And how do we fight to retain that capacity, or enable and nurture that capacity within the public sector to do that work?
So it's such an important question that I dedicated a whole chapter to it in the book, where I look at all the different myths that exist out there that have then led us to a situation where we have basically consultified government capacity. You know, this idea of, okay, yeah, but that's just project management. Let McKinsey do it. You know, what happens, and it's not McKinsey's fault, it's, you know, government not kind of taking ownership of the problems it has, that has been fueled by this idea that, again, coming back to the earlier point, that government is there to fix a problem, but then the actual doing, you know, the administration, the governance has to be done by an efficient kind of private institution, driven by kind of private goals of efficiency or private definitions of efficiency, as opposed to that kind of dynamic efficiency that I was talking about before in terms of those spillovers that happen along the way. But so the kind of in-house investment that you require in order to even have a functioning kind of portfolio approach, or thinking about risks and rewards within that portfolio, something we might have time for later, or even thinking about the directionality and what that means for the design of procurement, you know, grants and loans to crowd in as much private sector investment, that needs capacity and capability. And unfortunately, we've had this kind of massive outsourcing of that investment. And in the book, I talk about how NASA was aware of this. There was this guy, Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement, who was, he called it, he said, we have to be aware of brochuremanship. It's kind of cute, actually, right? Because at the time they didn't have PowerPoint. So there was just sexy little brochures that, you know, companies would come in and say, hire us, we'll do this for you. Aren't we great? And they said, we're just going to be captured by, you know, any company that comes in and says they want to work with us if we don't even understand what's happening. So we need to constantly, by we, NASA, invest in our own brain in order even to know how to work together well with the private sector, literally how to write the terms of reference, right, in the contracts. I mean, that's where I've seen it also go very wrong. The terms of reference are terrible. So, you know, it's not going to be a good marriage if the contract itself already starts wrong. And so for that, I mean, again, that's the reason I set up the Institute, because we have our own curriculum that we're trying to replace the existing one, which has been fed by public choice theory, new public management, which has basically convinced many civil servants that, yes, you have market failure, but even worse than market failure is government failure. And so take up as little place as possible, because otherwise you'll be crowding out business. And it just leads to really kind of small thinking, and ironically leads to crowding out. Because if you're not ambitious, if you're not trying to create public value, if you're not really pushing the frontier and, you know, redefining the market, which then also creates a new opportunity space for the private sector, you literally just end up taking up space, right? And, you know, the irony is you end up be quite useless, but it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. We think government's kind of rubbish, tell it to at best fix markets, occupy little space, don't have imagination, don't, you know, invest within your own resources. It doesn't end up necessarily also being a great place to attract people to even want to work. And I'm not saying there's not really brilliant civil servants globally. They are. They're heroes in many senses. But, you know, it's the contrast between what it looks like to present, you know, the dynamic, creative, wealth-creating side where the private sector is, and at best the enabling, fixing, regulating, redistributing public sector. Which one's going to be more attractive to someone who sees themselves as risk-taking and value-creating? So we really need to debunk that false contrast, but then create the capacity, the capabilities, the design, the organizational culture within public institutions to deliver on that. Because we shouldn't forget, we often do have the wrong bureaucracies. And the word bureaucratic shouldn't be a negative word. How many of us use, you know, the Kafkian bureaucrat or the word bureaucratic as a negative word? We need bureaucracies, but are they inertial, stagnant, boring bureaucracies? Or, you know, dynamic, creative, sexy bureaucracies, like I'm sure your office.
Look, we've got some of the best, I have to say. I mean, they are the experts, and there is a real trend, unfortunately, towards a managerial mindset. This idea that you can manage, if you're a manager and you're trained, you can manage anything, as opposed to having sector expertise, and that is crucial. You know, I've seen, arts grant assessment outsourced, for example, to management consulting, and that's absurd to me. I mean, you have to know the stuff that you're comparing it to. How can you judge excellence or impact or relevance if you don't? There's a
Tory lord in the UK government, Lord Agnew, who during COVID, because all these contracts became revealed, like Deloitte ended up doing our test and trace system and failing miserably. The vaccine rollout has been incredibly successful because it's been nested inside the National Health Service, community-based with GPs. But he said, because he started to look at these contracts, which by the way, I've been kind of talking about for a long time because Brexit itself was outsourced to consulting companies. He used a word, which I've started to use. He said, all these consultancies are infantilizing Whitehall, infantilizing. It's making government like a baby. It doesn't know what it's doing.
Look, I've got a question I think I want to come back and talk to you at the end of going to a few or audience questions about who sets that mission, who defines the mission, and how do we make it fair and inclusive. But let's talk about that at the very end. I just want to go to a couple of these excellent questions. I've got one here from Melina Morrison. Melina asks, what role does business model diversity play in the solution, including cooperatives and mutuals, in creating a fair and more equitable distribution of the benefits of economic activity? Because we do have sort of a monoculture, don't we, of business type within the private sector at the moment, and how do we have more of a permaculture approach, if you will, to business models?
It's a great question, and it's one that I really wish we'd have a bigger global conversation on, because there's different ways to do capitalism, right? It's not about capitalism, socialism, and we can have that discussion too, but there's varieties of capitalism, and it does come down to all sorts of different features of how we govern the different organizations that we talked about in their interrelationships. But within the business community, of course, some companies just literally are maximizing their share prices to the point that the S&P 500 companies have spent over $4 trillion, $4 trillion, that's 12 zeros, on just buying back their shares in the last 10 years. That's a lack of reinvestment back into the economy. That's why we get questions about, instead of blaming the robots for jobs, this is a lack of reinvestment in where mechanization is creating profits. If that isn't reinvested back into the economy, that's a corporate governance issue. It's not a blame the robots. Mechanization has been taking jobs, by the way, for 200 years. But as long as profits in one area were reinvested in another, we got new jobs, coming back to your previous point. But stakeholder value, which is often used as a word to describe a different business model from shareholder value, that ends up just kind of sounding academic, and so what does it actually mean? And we need to get experience. We need to go look with a magnifying glass, literally case studies of where it's worked well, right? So of course, the whole region of Scandinavia has experience with putting, trade union representatives on the boards of companies. Germany does too. I'm quite good friends with a trade unionist in Italy who said, so he was head of the whole metal mechanics sector. And he said that when Ducati was bought by the Germans, his experience was then negotiating, with the German government and the German companies. And he said, it's just completely different situation from Italy, where you're just not even at the table. So when workers are being asked to, sacrifice an increase in wages, in Italy, it's just like a diktat. In Germany, it was negotiated in exchange of what, for how long? What are you going to then, do for working conditions and investment and training and so on? Always looking at the future investment strategy, as opposed to just a sacrifice that you were being asked to take in. And so another thing is, there's regions of the world that have the history of cooperatives. That's why we're actually working in this part of Spain where, say, Mondragon, one of the largest cooperatives in the world in the industrial sector, not retail. Nowadays, you mainly have co-ops in retail, 87,000 workers. That whole region, the Basque region, as it tries to do a Green Deal and a green transition, well, what does it mean to do it through a cooperative lens, right? A place that has had the history of negotiation within that kind of collective value creation because of the co-op model. How does it use that experience and that learning for the transition, which is a regional one, not just a company one? And lastly, I think it is also a question of ownership, which we haven't really talked about. But in the end, that's also what co-ops and mutuals do. That's a pre-distribution way to think of inclusive growth before, how you create value is inclusive, not just saying, oh yeah, go create value and then we can always, redistribute later from the rich to the poor. That's, again, too little too late if you've messed things up along the way. So there's all sorts of really interesting insights on that. And that's, by the way, why I also think that the portfolio approach of missions has to be accompanied with concrete mechanisms to make sure we're socializing not just risks, but also rewards. And that's also where these conditionalities come in, the conditionalities on reinvestment and so on, but also in some cases, equity stakes and public wealth funds, the example I often give is Tesla and Solyndra. The US government gave them both during their portfolio of a green kind of deal, close to 500 million in a guaranteed loan. And then, Solyndra goes bust, taxpayer picks up the bill. Tesla does well. Oh, it must be Elon Musk is a genius. And they did exactly the opposite of what they should have done. The government, they said to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. Why would the government want, a stake in a company that's not paying back loans because it's not very good? Who knows? So had they said we get 3 million shares if things go well and you do pay back the loan, the price per share in that period, 2009, 2013, went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss, instead of just seeing it as a big public sector failure, and the next round of investment, right? So kind of a public venture capital kind of fund. We need much more creative thinking about that, and starting with the idea of kind of co-ops, mutuals, more inclusive forms of ownership, and how we create the value in the first place is a great place to start.
That example, the Tesla Solyndra one, I also refer to in my book, and the great example we have is Nokia and Citra as well, from Finland, where they did take a stake. The Finnish government did take a stake in the 60s in investment in Nokia when it was getting into telecommunications initially, and now has a sovereign wealth fund, an innovation fund that is funding the public conversation that needs to be had about a just transition and funding innovation and research, investment in research. So, we have an example of how that works already.
Or Yozma in Israel. They often call Israel startup nation. Well, guess what? It wouldn't have been without Yozma, a public venture capital fund.
There are so many great audience questions, I have to say. I'm going to ask you one from Ming Long, which is kind of quite unique to the Australian condition. We have been a very lucky country. Initially that was a phrase used ironically, but we've had this uninterrupted period of growth. We didn't really feel the impacts of the GFC. We haven't really felt the impacts socially of COVID either. We have been insulated from them to an extent. Potentially there are some economic impacts still to come. So there is also a culture of complacency in Australia that we have to counteract. And how do we overcome the apathy? Because there's a sort of a lack of urgency here to really transform or to champion transformative thinking. Have you got any, I know that's beyond the realm of economics strictly, but have you got any insights you can share with us?
Well, just one insight I have from when I visited Sydney and Melbourne. I'm trying to think when, everything's like become a fog since COVID began. I want to say 3 years ago. Was it 3 years ago? Yeah, exactly. It feels like 100 years ago. Last month feels like 100 years ago. So what really struck me from, I was brought around and giving talks to all sorts of different places. It was fascinating. It was such a great trip. But what struck me is that there was that sense of urgency in people. I really felt that there was a desire for change. You are so vulnerable to climate change, right? We saw that. Just remember, was it February last February, all the, fires. That's all I remember. It was really the month before COVID-19 became a household word, right?
But, we all thought, this changes everything. And then March happened, Yeah.
Our memory is incredibly limited, but I did feel, and I was there before the fires, right? The year before, that there was actually a desire for real change. And there was, the complacency in some ways was more in the, I don't want to say the political system, but it felt there was a real mismatch. And so I think that's why it is so important. And maybe this is a good moment to bring in the point that you said you wanted to raise in the end, which then we'll have no time, but, the citizen engagement side. Think of what we've learned also in the last year, besides COVID, Black Lives Matter, the whole Me Too movement, Fridays for the Future, where 16, 15, 14, 13-year-olds are much more active actually than, our or the older generations have been. What does it mean to actually really bring movements, social movements, to the core of the discussion you and I are having, right? Again, I mentioned before, we wouldn't have weekends, 8-hour work days. Children would be still working in factories if we didn't have a labor movement. But, broaden out the word movement and think of it as a critical component of how we shape and co-create markets. Keep coming back to that, right? Markets are co-created and co-shaped. movements, obviously have often resisted, certain things that are happening, but let's start looking at them as being proactively designing, the markets of the future. And I think the fact that I definitely sensed movements in Australia, and it seemed a bit disjointed from how some of the political debate was having. And then the election that occurred the spring after I came, I think also reflected the fact there was lots of fear of the future, as opposed to getting people to actually welcome the great opportunities for new jobs, new forms of skills that a kind of a green transition would provide in Australia. That can't be a top-down lecture, with a PowerPoint. That has to be done through real, genuine, not tokenistic, not condescending engagement. I think that's really probably the biggest question for a country like Australia, where you have the desire, but the how and the fear of the future continue to.
That's the thing in Australia, like depending on your poll, it's like 74 to 84% of Australians want immediate action on climate change. And yet it's very hard to find, at the same time we have the major political parties both really attached to the fossil fuel industry and not being courageous in presenting alternatives. So that's why I want to bring you to this.
People are right to be fearful, though, right? Because unless you have the right design of the future strategy, it will, hurt jobs. It will hurt skills. It's not going to happen on its own. And that's what's happened with big tech, right? We didn't manage that process. So it is true that robots and AI are potentially a danger to jobs and to wages, but there's nothing inevitable and deterministic in that. We can govern the future of big data and AI to actually be good for jobs and good for new skills and new services and new industries that would come about by creating opportunities in that space instead of it just being labor displacing.
But it's got to be governed, and that's the key point. And I want to bring you to this last question, which is, how do we define the mission? Who defines the mission? How do we make sure it's fair and inclusive? And I love that you're a supporter of citizens' assemblies as a way to get people engaged with policy and involved in the process and setting the mission and as you say, defining, implementing and assessing the success of the mission as well. Can you bring us to a close here, Mariana, by telling us, how do we get citizens actually involved in this and make it bottom up?
So, I mean, there's different ways to think about this. One is literally through the new types of institutions we require. So, citizen assemblies and other forms like that, we've already mentioned it, are absolutely the kind of social innovations we require to have that national or city level or council level discussion. But another thing is, I learned so much just from seeing my own kids. I've got 4 of them in lockdown. No, they're great kids. About how they and their friends understood the plastic-free mission, not because an academic or a business leader, a policy leader, a mayor came in to talk about it, but they saw a film, Blue Planet of David Attenborough really raised the imagination, increased the kind of discussion that people were having, because they saw that last episode of all those baby dolphins, choking on plastic. That spoke to kids, So obviously I'm not saying let's just make a bunch of movies, even though my husband's a film producer, so he wouldn't mind. But no, but like the creative arts, the humanities, poetry. Just think of the inauguration of Biden and that amazing young poet. Why does she speak so much to our hearts, right? It just, poetry, the humanities, film, the creative sector. But think of creativity as also like a cross-cutting, area that we need to be investing in across all missions. There's something about together reimagining our future and even thinking how a better life can be possible for everyone. That doesn't happen just by, having a side dinner conversation with some friends. We should be investing in that capacity too, not to reimagine. And I just want to say that. And why am I saying that? Because too often in my world, which is the kind of innovation policy world, industrial strategy world, at best we think of like the sciences, engineering, business, and government. But, again, the humanities, even just in academia, which is my sector, gets completely left aside. But also, what it means to really invest in that kind of Amartya Sen kind of sense in the capabilities of people, also to be more creative in order for them to even access their opportunities, right? He makes this link between capabilities and opportunities. The creative potential that everyone has inside needs to be invested in. And I think that has to be part of our mission-oriented thinking, because the discussion about how we actually want to live together requires a process of imagining, reimagining, and dreaming, not a utopia, but really dreaming together about a better way. And there's so much inequality. I mean, we've talked about, the issues around, Camden, South Africa, and so on, this kind of real inequality that also creates hate. I mean, a lot of the knife crime that I've talked about in London, if you speak to a lot of people who deal with the mental health side of it, there's self-hate, amongst both the, perpetrators and the victims within a very narrow community that has really been left behind. What does it mean to fight self-hate? It's much harder than seeing it through, say, a crime and a policing angle, right? So that does require investing in people's souls. And I just think that process is so much harder than getting to the moon. And I think that's a good place to stop, because the last thing that we want to do is say, oh, let's just, apply the Apollo program to all these really difficult societal missions. But the discussion we've had means that we also need to really rethink government along the way.
And we have to center people and their ability to flourish, and putting human flourishing, at the center of the mission of government is, I think where that's the moonshot for me. And
I agree.
Mariana, this has been so extraordinary. And for everyone who's listening, we have a moonshot here, Sydney. We've got to bring Mariana to work with us here in Sydney, right? So this is my plea to you. Let's figure out how we can work together and keep this ambition alive. And I know that the demand is out there in the community too. We've just got to figure out how we can connect with people and tap into that. And Mariana, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and being here and sharing all your ideas with us.
Can we save all these questions? Because I'm just now looking at the chat, because I was just looking at you. There's maybe someone who, I'm sure the committee.
They can
send them to me, and you and I will have a cocktail.
Let's do it. Let's have a cocktail and go through
an open public cocktail. But I'm so looking forward to, collaborating with you in whatever way and having this conversation really just being the aperitivo to a longer dinner.
Wonderful. Well, have a wonderful day and have a wonderful evening, everyone here in Sydney. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.